So we're actually totally bang on time, which is excellent. So, hey, so we've got somebody new in our hot seat this week. John, you've been
Absolutely. Hey, Roy, how you doing? So we've got Roy with us this week. So Roy's an independent consultant. I've emphasised that a couple of times as I introduced him. He's a P3 risk associate. He runs the for PMO learning. He runs their assurance for PMO professionals course. He's my sort of go-to person for anything around governance and assurance. So when we were looking at what was going on with the post office scandal, and we thought it might be an interesting one to explore here. Then Roy was obviously our sort of our go-to person to bring in and sit in our hot seat. Now, when we first spoke to Roy about this opportunity, he was very keen to stress that none of this was his fault. He wasn't involved. He was never there. All those kind of things. So he's joining us as a very independent person, just sort of reflecting on what we're seeing as they're going through, as more and more of the situation is unraveling and emerging. So of course, I think as most of us know, hundreds of sort of postmasters, postmistresses, sub-pub postmasters were wrongly prosecuted by the post office after essentially faulty software calculated money was missing from post office branches, which turned out not to be the case. System was put in by Fujitsu. There's the post office, so they're the big players: Fujitsu, post office, Bays in government, obviously now DBT. Lots of people involved there that should have had eyes on this and should have had appropriate governance around these projects. So I guess probably a good place to start, Roy, is from what you've seen, what sort of assurance would you expect to see in place versus what we know of what was in place?
But that's a very broad question to ask, really, because there isn't one place you get assurance from ever on any project. A project of this type, this magnitude, you'd expect assurance to come from all sorts of levels and all sorts of places. So just to add to what John was saying in terms of my involvement, it was my point really was that I have no more direct insight into the facts and figures and actually what did definitely go wrong than anybody else. So my perspective is very much from what I've read and the sort of questions and perspective I would have approached if I had been involved in that project at any stage. So I think it goes back to the very beginning. And one of the things I'm a bit of a broken record about is when it comes to assurance is that you really can't talk about assurance just in isolation. You need to think about assurance in context of or in relationship with risk management and governance, because assurance on its own doesn't really do anything. It doesn't necessarily look at the right things. So you've really got to look at that sort of GRA, governance, risk and assurance framework trilogy, I refer to it as being, at every stage through the project. And you can go right back to the very beginning. So 1996, I understand this contract was awarded. Immediately one would ask the question, well, there would have been a business case within the post office for this. There presumably would have been some form of business case within Bays, and Fujitsu would have had some form of onboarding process. I don't know what process they would have used for accepting the contract, but at that stage, right back in the of course 1996, that would have been, I think that was the placing of the contract. So the procurement would have happened sometime before that. So what questions were being asked? What was in those business cases around assumptions and risks? Had anybody put any effort into and thought into, well, how are we going to govern and assure this project through its lifetime? And I think it was recognized at the time that this was a very new, radical thing. I don't think anybody had done a system rollout like this ever in the world. So there was a real novelty in this. Well, my first question would be, well, what was believed, what was understood to have been the risks back in those at that time, and what were the arrangements that were being put in place around governance and assurance?
That's a really good question. I mean, is it possible when we think about high levels of novelty? Yes, but this project was sort of kind of bleeding edge in a number of ways. But and a lot of our companies are often doing projects that are new, if not new on a global scale, new to that organization in degrees of novelty. And I've seen sort of different ways stakeholder groups interact with those. Do you think there's a chance that when business cases for these kind of projects where there's high complexity, high levels of novelty, that we almost end up not putting explicit risk and assurance controls in place at that stage, because people don't understand it, they shy away from actually putting it in? Is that something that you'd say happens?
I think behavioural attitudes permeate assurance throughout, and I'm sometimes asked the question, not so much recently, because I think people have got it more, but maybe a couple of years ago, people asked the question, well, we have so much assurance now in our projects, but they still keep going wrong. So why do they keep going wrong? And throughout of my career, even before I started becoming a dedicated assurance professional, you could tell it was about behaviours, people finding routes around, people not following the standards and the processes because it was easier not to do so. And there's always this so often this culture of optimism and political expediency. And of course, you mustn't forget with something like this. This was, as I understand it, a politically very important project to happen. So it's politically important for the government, for BEIS, for the post office, and strategically it would have been important for Fujitsu as well. So there would have been a collective group think there. This has got to be successful. I also think and suspect, but I don't have any proof of this, that there was probably an expectation that what they thought they had found in those first few years of rollout, all these supposed corruptions and misappropriation of funds and everything, that's what they expected to find. I think there was probably an assumption that, and probably it may have been a very sound assumption, that for years and years and years, sub-postmasters had been fiddling the books. It's a terrible accusation and unprovable. I suspect there was that belief or that suspicion, certainly within the post office and certainly within government. So the idea, because the implementation of the Horizon system was, as I understand it, the first time that post office could actually get real documentation of what's happening in sub post offices. So when they started to see all this, they were probably starting to see what they expected to see. Who was there challenging the assumptions? Who was there saying, well, actually, is this correct? We've gone from 0 to 100 in terms of these prosecutions. Where was the audit committee in the post office, for example, looking at this and thinking, is this really what we expected? This is quite bad. Should we be challenging that? And we do know that the post office internal audit function was very small. I don't have, because this goes over a period of over 20 years. So the internal audit arrangements would have changed over that period of time. But I've seen one report done by a very expert internal auditor, an IT internal auditor, who again wasn't directly involved, but he'd done a lot of studying around this. And he said there were at times at the post office there was like one person, 2 people in internal audit function, and the type of audit you would need to do around this sort of project, they wouldn't have the first idea or even anything like the capacity to be able to carry out. I've lost my train of thought there. So I think there's something around the challenging the assumptions and being independent enough and having enough time and resource and insight to be asked to ask those sort of challenging questions when there is a culture of this has to be successful, and actually what we're finding is what we expected to see anyway.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think we've got and you're right. It was interesting because you started talking about the sort of governance, risk, assurance sort of triangle there. But then, as you're rightly mentioning, the assumptions, the bias, the sort of human elements of this also obviously play a massive part through everything. There must be PMO people on this sort of session who've joined us today, who have probably looked at what's happening and will have thought, well, that couldn't happen in my organization, and then may have those nagging doubts about a couple of projects they may have. What would be your sort of your advice or your takeaways that I think that PMO people could take away in terms of what they could do to make sure they've got a degree of confidence that the right assurance is in place and governance in place around their projects?
Well, I mean, the PMOs have a very key role to play in terms of assurance. Exactly what their role will be of a person within a PMO in an organisation has got will very much depend on their position, the PMO, and where the PMO fits in to the organisation. What are the expectations of the PMO? Some PMOs, they will be recognised as having a project assurance responsibility, and they'll have people. They may have a department or a section within it actually responsible for project assurance. Smaller organisations won't have that in their PMOs. That's a difficult question to ask at that sort of level.
The key things, firstly, understand as a PMO, understand, does your organisation have an assurance function? Reach out to them, engage with them. Do your processes align with those? It's quite possible that a project PMO may have spun up in the organisation independently. So is there alignment there? I guess it's probably a good place to start, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, PMOs, in my view, PMOs they've got a delivery, an assurance delivery role, sort of second line of defence type of that sort of area. Really key role to play in terms of setting policies, standards, frameworks, checking that people are following them, supporting people in following them. Ensuring reporting is done robustly, all that sort of stuff. But they've also got a role in terms of taking a step back from it all and advising the organisation generally on assurance. Does this organisation have sufficient assurance? The problem often is, though, is that the PMO's voice is quite quiet in this area. It's not a strong voice. And I would always encourage good relationship between a PMO and the internal audit function, because the one body in an organisation that does have the clout to be ask questions around assurance is the internal audit function. So foster a good relationship there. And if you're in a PMO and you are aware that there are assurance issues in the way that projects are being run, a conversation with their internal audit department may help them to focus their efforts on looking at the right things. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be sort of telling tales out of school or anything like that. It's just a good ongoing relationship, assurance relationship between different providers, the PMO at the second line and internal audit at the third line. Yeah. There's always also, all organizations should have a whistleblowing line, whistleblowing process and system. And of course, the worst comes to the worst, then that's the way you should do it. Whistleblowing, I understand, was pretty much absent from the whole of Horizon. So both within Fujitsu, Post Office and Bates, and this is the work this IT auditor have done. There was no really existing whistleblowing, and it's a key component in good assurance.
That's good, Roy. Thank you so much. I know there's obviously so much, and we've barely had time to scratch the surface of it in our short lunchtime session today. But a few key things there. So PMO people, firstly, make some, if this has resonated, make some time this afternoon to find out who your internal audit team are, reach out and say hello to them and start a conversation there. Think about the process that exists in your projects for whistleblowing, even formal process within the organization, yes, but even ability for project teams to come and have a quiet chat with the PMO as a way through things as well. And also, again, the importance emphasized there of speaking to the business as well. We often think about how we speak to project managers, but how we also look to the business and be comfortable calling out the business that we work in if we don't believe they've got the structures in place around what we're delivering as well. Thank you, Roy, so much. I'm conscious of time. Lindsay, you probably want to wrap us up, I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Roy. And you've got some links and things in there to some previous stuff that Roy's done for the House of PMO as well. So thank you very much. Bye.